Alright, so I'm going to go live. Remember to guard your privacy and abide by community guidelines. That's very nice. Okay. So, okay. I have my, oops. Yeah, so for oh, that's a little weird. Huh. So, oh, actually, so here's me learning how to do this protocol. So Paige, thank you for logging in. What I will do usually, I think, is actually a verbal response. I'll just watch the feed, and we'll see how this works. So Paige, if you'd like to type something back, I figure this is kind of the online equivalent of a lecture course where you can type in responses to me and 40 people can do that simultaneously, no problem. But then I would need to, be able to verbally respond. Meanwhile, do you have any questions about the images that I'm showing? I've learned how to put a rolling slideshow up along with my video feed, so I figured you might as well get some images in there since I'm tied directly to my computer right now. Ah. Hello, Mary. So one of the things you should know is that there seems to be a pretty long delay between me picking up interactions and then being able to respond. When I look at my streaming encoder software and then I look at the what I see on YouTube, there's a 10-second delay, something like that. Oh. Yeah, so the rolling slideshow, I'm glad you like the rolling slideshow page. What happened was, as I was researching all of this, um, YouTube says, well, you should manage the speed of your upload from your side. So I had to learn encoding software. I'm using OBS, in case you're curious. And OBS says, oh, yeah, you can compile all sorts of stuff into your video stream. So I said, well, let's see how we can do that. So I put up the SF State logo. And then I was like, oh, wait, I could show slides from my computer. So you were asking about where they're from. There are two sets of images here. One is my photos from Kabul from 2007 when I did a lot of research on informal settlements. And the other is some pictures from the Philippines. So the reason why I'm showing the Philippines is because there's a lot of informal settlements in the Philippines as well. And unfortunately, they use very different building materials. They use scrap plywood, scrap wood, scrap plastic. And when land developers want to clear out informal settlements in the Philippines, they just set fire to them. So that's why you see burning. You see a burning informal settlement. In contrast to that, if you look at the informal settlement pictures I'm showing from Kabul, they use clay brick, what Americans would know as adobe. And it doesn't burn. It holds up pretty well in a desert, so it's very durable. The only problem is that Kabul has severe earthquakes. So unfortunately, since they don't use wood, if they have a severe earthquake, that's a problem. Okay, so it looks like Jason is saying that the audio streaming is working well. You guys are hearing me clearly? Yeah, so here's another thing that I've been trying to figure out is I'm just using, I don't know if you can see it, I'm just using an earbud that plugs into a smartphone and a smartphone microphone. I think for purposes of a lecture, this is fine. I'm not doing performing music or something like that. So I think just if I'm audible and you can understand me, that's good enough. The other thing I'm thinking is that some of you, it sounded like when we were talking on Monday, some of you said you didn't have access to Wi-Fi and you were going to have to access this from your phones. So if you have to access it from your phones, you're going to need to have a pretty narrow stream coming through so that it doesn't overwhelm your own download speed. So I figure that it's not just my upload speed that's a limitation, but it's also your download speed depending upon where you are. Yeah. So as for the rest of you, can you oh, okay, so Paige says the auto stream is great. Okay, good. It sounds like that worked out. What I was trying to figure out is with a YouTube stream, a lot of the bias goes towards having the video or the image feed be really clear. And for our purposes, that's not so important. I think I'll keep the frame rate very low. I have the frame rate at 10 frames per second. Gamers put it up to 60 frames per second. But I figure, I can look a little sort of herky-jerk. That's fine. having clear audio is more important, and yeah, being able to read what you guys are writing in, that seems to work. So, um, for those of you that were using Zoom, I know some of you actually met using the SF State Zoom. If somebody can contrast that for me to say how that worked, because if you remember in class, I heard about somebody using Zoom and I thought, how can you do that for a large group? It doesn't make sense. Because I thought, well, if you have 40 people all trying to participate simultaneously, you're going to get chaos on the stream. So I didn't understand how that works. So I haven't actually seen it. I haven't tested the SF State Zoom facility, but that's because I've spent the last 4 days trying to figure out this technology. So if any of you had an effective large class somehow participating using Zoom, I'd love to know how that would work as well. However, it's sounding like, yeah. So Annie is saying, yeah, connected to home laptop Wi-Fi. That's working for you. So this stream is fast enough, at least for Wi-Fi. Okay. Um, yeah. Gersten, Gersten. Who's Gersten? Oh, is that Ellie? I can't remember your first name now. Gersten. So you should just know that your names come up with, I guess, whatever your YouTube identity is. That's probably how you've accessed this. So, yeah. So some of us use full name. I can understand for privacy reasons. Some of you will not. Oh yeah, so Andre points out that on Zoom you can mute and unmute, and I learned that in group talk on Skype years ago. Um, but then everybody has to be pretty disciplined in doing that, understanding that protocol. Yeah, it is Emma. It's Emma Gersten, right? Um, and I didn't want to give students a hard time about that. It might be. Oh yeah, so Paige is pointing that out. You can mute and oh, and you can also turn off camera, which would lower the rate of throughput for pickup. Huh. Yeah, I get that. Huh. If it worked, okay, I'm cool with that. So one of the things I'd worry about is that some people might not, be technically savvy, and they might have a mic that has. If you have a lot of background noise, if you got a dog who's freaking out, or you're near a place with cars that are going by, any of those things might trigger the mic to start turning on. So that's what I was worried about. There might be a lot of interrupts because I know a number of you are probably even logging in from work or someplace where people are, talking behind you or something. So I'm still working with limited information, but my guess is that this format can work for lecture, but it also means you could log in kind of from anywhere. You could be at, say, at a Starbucks, and that might be people making espressos right next to you, and all sorts of environmental noise, and that's not going to be a problem if you've got earbuds in and you can hear me, and then you can see the text coming from other classmates. Because frankly, we're getting pretty good student participation here. This pleases me. So, do any of you want to talk about that reading from this week? I figure if we've got a successful enough basic technology test, maybe we should talk about how cities deal with epidemics. Oh yeah, I have to wait for the time lag. So it's kind of like waiting for people to raise their hands. Now I just have to wait for you to get my stream. Hmm. I wonder if I had a faster computer, whether the lag between what I'm seeing on my streaming software and what you're seeing on YouTube, whether I could get that time delay down. I hope I can. I don't know. We're going to have a sort of massive upgrade of my in-house internet on next Wednesday, so we'll see. Oh, nobody's texting. They don't want to talk about cholera, epidemics, cities, what we do. So I have to say, this is a pretty amazing time for policy purposes. There's plenty we should all be watching here in real time with how different places are reacting. I'm glad the governor of California said no gatherings larger than 250 people, and a bunch of folks have started, closing down things like, large concerts, and NBA suspending the rest of their season. Um, I haven't learned anything new about the type of the disease, though. As far as I know, coronavirus it's a subspecies of cold, which is infectious as hell. So we've just lived with colds for thousands of years, and even with modern medicine, we never tried tackling, managing or containing colds because we're more worried about cancer. There's a lot of other things that seem more immediate, but yeah, now we've got a cold that can proceed to, potentially lethal pneumonia. So how do we react? Um, yeah, it's a bit of a revisit to the very beginning of modern planning as we know it. I mean, that's one of the things I took away from not just the Stephen Johnson book, but quite a few of them. Like, how do you convince people? When do they change their minds? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, fair point, Paige. Yeah. So the fact that you could just take off the pump handle and deny access to the water, yes, it was simpler. Um, yeah, that's true. So in some ways, like the actual technology they could use to react to it was simpler and more accessible, and thank goodness, because in 1854 they didn't even know that microbes cause disease. So they were really limited in the knowledge they were working with. Um, oh, cesspool, right? So cesspool is something that how to put this? In rural areas, even in California today, there are people have these cesspool tanks, and so the sewage water just flows into a tank, and it might sit in there for a couple of weeks or a month, and then a truck service will come by and pump out the tank. Um, in 19th century London, they would just have the sewage water accumulate in the basement in some cases, underneath the apartment building. And so sometimes they'd have stone lined pits. They would look sort of like a well, but it contained sewage water. Um, yeah, so that's what a cesspit would look like. Um, oh yeah, so the question of how Jon Snow found these clues, it's not in the chapter that I assigned. It's much of the story of the rest of the book. But part of what happened was the cholera outbreak happened in one parish. And so in England, the Church of England has parishes, just like Roman Catholics have parishes in Catholic countries. And the pastor was named Henry Whitehead. And so he knew a lot of people in the parish. And as soon as the cholera outbreak happened, he would notice families that no longer started showing up on Sunday morning. So, and because people trusted him, he could go and interview people and ask about, um, who was sick and what had happened. So when Dr. Snow showed up, he met up with Henry Whitehead, and Henry enabled him to have personal access, personal interview access to people all across the neighborhood. So that's how Snow got access to sort of spatial ethnographic data. That was the key there. Um, but then all of the other people in public health at that time, which was only a 10-year-old public activity, like the Board of Public Health, I think was created in 1843 or 1844, so 10 or 11 years before this cholera outbreak. So they were pretty new at even figuring out how to react to diseases in an organized way at all. But they were still going with the bad air hypothesis. And he thought, that doesn't seem to be the case. So then he did a bunch of inquiries of houses where people did not get sick and places where they did get sick. And what he found that really convinced him was that the people that did get sick all were drawing water from this one particular pump. There was even a poor workhouse nearby, and poorer people tended to get sick more often than just like now. And very few people in that poor workhouse got sick with this cholera outbreak. He was wondering why. And it turned out that they had a well inside of the workhouse itself. So they were drawing their water from a well inside the workhouse. Conversely, there was a household where practically everybody died, and it was quite far away. It was closer to other water pumps. And so he thought, well, does my hypothesis hold up here? And so he did some interviews because he had access to asking questions of people in the neighborhood. And it turned out that the kids would go to school in a different part of the neighborhood, and they would return going past the Broad Street pump, and they would always pump out some water and bring that back to the house. So they were accessing water from the infected pump, and that's what wiped out that family. But it also then provided pretty good confirmation for him that it was spread by water, it wasn't spread by air, it wasn't even really spread by coughing, and that it was spread from a specific pump. So that's why he asked them to remove the handle from that pump. So Stephen Johnson, in writing about this in 2006 or whenever he published that, he said that there's some evidence that by the time the pump handle was removed, that pump might have actually been flushed clean. That it might not have been, it might not have still had cholera in the reservoir of that pump, but nobody really knows. But he was pointing out that the sad irony is that the way you treat cholera is you drink a lot of water, you stay hydrated. And so on the one hand, you have to be cautious of water in terms of spreading it, but on the other hand, what you then need access to is a lot of fresh, clean water, and you just keep drinking, and you stay hydrated, and then you'll just kind of live through it, and it will flush out of your system. Yeah. The reason why I assigned this particular chapter about the pump handle is that Henry Whitehead, the Church of England pastor in that neighborhood, he helped John Snow get access to the different households, but he still believed in the miasma theory. He still believed in the bad air theory for a long time. And so this chapter was sort of about the process of him getting convinced. It's about a public leader changing their mind based on evidence and changing how they reacted. And I think for this moment, that's pretty important. Notice that, when I assigned this chapter, our president had not yet done a serious sit-down conference where he said, this is a serious thing we must react to, which he did, I guess, was it yesterday or 2 days ago? And once he finally had done so, once you had political leadership saying, this is serious, we need to take serious action, then a lot of responses followed very, very quickly. A lot of people reacted very quickly to start to slow down the rate of the spread of the coronavirus. So, yeah. So it's worth looking at this story in terms of thinking about a hypothesis. How do you test it? How do you use spatial evidence in a city? That's a reason why people teach this case of the cholera outbreak as a first lesson in a GIS course, because this was a geospatial analysis. But that's only one side of it. And I think here in the last 4 years, we've really learned the hard other side of it is you can have a lot of data out there, but then what convinces people to change their mind? When does the evidence persuade somebody? Because it's not like obvious data is persuasive in itself. There have to be other conditions that convince somebody. So Andre's pointing. Yeah, Trump feels he doesn't need to be tested. Then again, he probably will be. And he's in a condition of a lot of exposure. He meets a lot of people who travel. I think he's still practicing shaking of hands, an ancient tradition where you show that you don't have a blade in your right hand because you shake hands with somebody. That comes from the Roman Republic, so far as I know. And to some degree, we share some diseases and maintain our immune systems by having enough sort of sharing back and forth. So there's a degree to which we need to kind of ride that balance between maintaining a healthy immune system from exposure. But yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I think some of the rhetoric around Trump supporters has been pretty unhealthy. Yeah. Yeah, Mary's right. The Reverend thought that Dr. Snow was wrong, and I think maybe that's a healthy way to actually get persuaded. If you think somebody's wrong and you then kind of set about to say, well, they're wrong, I'm sure the Earth is flat, and here's how I'm going to show it. I'll float a high balloon and take a look from space, and suddenly, from high up enough, you can see the curvature of the Earth. If you see it with your own test, with your own experiment, maybe that's the most persuasive. Um, but it's hard for people to change their minds, and I don't think anything about the modern era changes that. We do have much more access to information, but that doesn't mean that our psychology has necessarily changed. And I think when we get convinced of something, we tend to cling to that pretty hard. Yeah, so that's something that we're looking at right now. So, for example, I think from our point of view in this course and thinking about public policy, what we should all pay attention to is how are we now setting up procedures to respond to something new? And what's new here is not contagious disease. What's new here is the cold, which we've always lived with and which we've always kind of put up with. The cold now has a strain which can trigger potentially lethal pneumonia. So this isn't the flu. We were all paying more attention to the flu because the Spanish flu killed a lot of people back in 1918, so we were worried about it. But now we have a cold that can trigger essentially a sudden acute respiratory syndrome, a SARS, a type of SARS. So how do we deal with that? Colds, both rhinovirus and coronavirus types of colds, they're very highly infectious. That's not new. They've been that way. So now we have sort of a global urban complex, people traveling around all the time, goods traveling around all the time. What do we do? It's too late to prevent us having this cold sort of wash through the whole population. It's too late. That takes a lot of preparation, a lot more understanding of the pathology of this particular virus, and setting up protocols that we haven't set up. So how will we react? What policies will we put in place? Yeah, restricting movement will slow down the rate of infection. It will not stop the infection. Yeah, that's one of the issues with colds. They are well adapted to infecting humans. So yeah, unless we can figure out a really effective vaccine against colds, we have to live with that, and it will spread worldwide. That's pretty given. If we restrict movement, what it does is it slows down the rate of infection, and that will hopefully enable medical systems in different cities to remain capable of treating people that have severe pneumonia, severe respiratory distress. So it's not really preventing anything, it's more changing the timing. And hopefully changing the timing so it stays within the capabilities we have for treatment. Oh yeah, so the question about shutting down all of London. Yeah, that's an interesting question because, of course, the last time London dealt with a major epidemic before 1854 was the Black Plague in 1665. And the Black Plague, I think, killed a third of the people in the city of London in 1665. So they had faced serious epidemics before. Unfortunately, in the 1660s and still in the 1850s, and I think still to this day in the 2010s, 2020s, we don't really have a way of shutting down a whole city. Wealthy people can flee. There's actually an interesting document by Boccaccio from when the Black Plague hit Italy in the 1300s about fleeing outside of Italian cities, fleeing Florence and seeing the deaths in Florence, and that was the 1350s, I think. Um, Londoners did the same thing. The wealthy would get in their stagecoaches and they would flee outside of London. So that's so for the wealthy they could avoid high rates of infection by getting out. At this point, there's no place to flee to in that sense. There's coronavirus infections in 49 of the 50 U.S. states right now. It's all over the world at this point, just because it's a cold. Um, yeah. Oh, so in London. So here was the other thing about the cholera outbreak. John Snow started investigating this very quickly. Um, and part of the story in the other chapters of the book is that the news of the outbreak had not spread, and partly because the press was a little nervous about causing a panic. Um, I don't know that that's a good thing, but the news of the cholera outbreak was kind of limited in 1854. But that said, the people like Edmund Chadwick, who was the founder and the head of the Board of Health at that point in 1854, he did look into it, and so he was thinking, after the fact, well, what would they do? But Chadwick just insisted on, it's miasma, cover your mouth, stay away from bad smells, don't cough at somebody. And you might notice that a lot of those protocols would work today. They're pretty effective with the even with the coronavirus. When people talk about do the cough into your sleeve, if you've got it, you're going to slow the spread of it if you do that. And social distancing does help. What they didn't know was that aggressive washing of your hands will also help, because they didn't realize that the hands, that the virus can last on the hands, because that has nothing to do with bad air. Your hands don't smell bad if you've coughed on them. So the miasma theory was effective for a lot of the diseases at the time, including the cold, including the flu, because if you're worried about bad air, you would stay away from a place where there's a household of people who are infected. It's also effective in slowing the spread of tuberculosis. So people would stay away from my house, because even if they couldn't smell the bad air, they felt like there must be bad air in here, and if I go in here and I breathe this air, I will get sick. And that is true. The causal agent's not there. People haven't figured out that it's microbes yet, but in practice, that's true. So the miasma theory worked really well, and that's one reason it was hard to persuade people that it was not a valid theory. In data science, I guess I would call that a confusion of proximal cause. It's like thinking that people get better at mathematics as their shoe size gets larger, and the evidence is pretty strong that if you measure shoe size, as shoe size gets larger, people do get better at mathematics. But it's because the underlying cause is that they are growing and their brains are developing, and they get better at math because their brains are developing. But you can find a really solid correlation between increasing shoe size and greater competence at math. And so that working theory is viable. It's effective to a degree. It's not actually explanatory, but empirically it does work. So likewise, the miasma theory, empirically, it was effective for every contagious disease that had existed in England until cholera. And the problem with cholera is it it's not related to coughing. It's not spread by that mechanism whatsoever. So not like tuberculosis, not like the cold, not like the flu. Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, water that's been infected with cholera, it doesn't become cloudy. It has no aroma. Um, yeah, so it's from just a visual inspection, you cannot tell clean water from infectious water when it comes to a cholera outbreak. Mm. Okay. So, for those of you who are online now, if you could just sound off, it sounds like this streaming does work, and we can use this protocol, and it's only going to get better once I can increase my throughput speed with an upgrade in my house next week. Um, yeah. So I will also look at a bit more about YouTube because I assume that this stream is actually going to be available to other people. It'll be stored on YouTube. It'll be stored on my channel. So I think that all of the other students will be able to access this. In fact, the whole world will. I haven't restricted it from public access yet. So I will seek your responses and see if I can get some guidance. If this is good enough, we will resume lectures starting on Monday, and we will use this protocol. If somebody finds there was actually a really serious advantage to Zoom, please let me know, because I might have to shift my attention to figuring out how that SF State technology works there, and use that. But at this point, it looks like this is gonna work, so we'll use this. So Paige says, sounding off, going to prepare for the emergency conference by going to the grocery store. Well done, Paige. Yes, canned food, ramen, peanut butter. Yeah, I'm not sure what else. Stuff that doesn't spoil. But try to stay healthy. It turns out drinking tea, probably good, certainly doesn't hurt. Stay hydrated, right? Don't let your body get stressed any more than it is. Yeah, so the other thing is that if it looks like this works, this frees up my attention and focus so I can get back to grading. So I would rather do that. Let me see. Yeah, Mary signing off. Jeff says it looks good. Okay, so Jason says this looks good. Okay. Right? Okay. So I will keep checking my email after this as well to find out whether somebody has some other observations about using the on-campus Zoom. But for the moment, I'm going to proceed with the assumption that this is what we'll use for lectures for the time being until the CDC says the all clear. Okay, so with that, I'm going to sign off, and all of you have a lovely day. The weather is beautiful in Berkeley. I see a little bit of fog. I hope it's not too cold and windy over there near the SF State campus, but do try to enjoy yourselves. And with that, I'm going to end the stream. Take care.